What if the quiet kid you mocked every day, the one who never fought back, was hiding a secret that could ruin you? Imagine taunting, shoving, and humiliating someone, thinking they're just another easy mark, only to discover they're the son of a ruthless mafia kingpin. At Crestview High, a group of bullies led by the arrogant Jake Harlan thought they could break Marco Vitale, a new transfer student who seemed weak and defenseless. They laughed at his silence, pushed him in the halls, and humiliated him in front of the school, oblivious to the storm they were unleashing. Marco's calm exterior hid a world of whispered deals, shadowed power, and a father whose name alone could make grown men tremble. This is the story of how a gang of reckless teens learned the hard way that some people are untouchable, and the price of their mistake would haunt them forever. The morning bell rang through Crestview High, its sharp chime swallowed by the chaos of slamming lockers and chattering students. Marco Vitale slipped through the crowd, his hands tucked into the pockets of a plain hoodie, his dark eyes scanning the hallways with a quiet intensity. To the untrained eye, he was just another new kid, unremarkable, blending into the sea of faces. But there was something in the way he moved, deliberate and composed, like a predator pacing through unfamiliar territory. He wasn't here to make waves, not if he could help it. His father, Antonio Vitale, had been clear. Keep your head down, Marco. Learn to live like they do. Normal. Normal. The word felt like a foreign language to Marco. He'd grown up in a world of coded glances, hushed conversations, and the weight of his father's name, a name that could open doors or end lives. Normal was for people who didn't know what it was like to hear a room go silent when a certain man walked in. Marco wanted to honor his father's wishes. He wanted to be the kid who went to class, made a few friends, and stayed out of trouble. But he knew better than most that wanting something didn't make it real. Trouble had a way of finding him, like it could smell the difference in his blood. And at Crestview High, trouble wore a smirk and called itself Jake Harlan. It started on Marco's third day. He was at his locker, swapping out books, when a shoulder slammed into his, hard enough to send his notebook skidding across the floor. "Watch it, new kid," a voice drawled, dripping with mockery. Marco didn't flinch. He bent down, picked up the notebook, and tucked it under his arm, his face blank. Jake Harlan stood a few feet away, flanked by two of his buddies, all grins and swagger. Jake was tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of guy who'd been coasting on his size and charm since middle school. His crew, Ethan and Tyler, fed off his energy, their laughter sharp and practiced. To them, Marco was fresh meat, a quiet kid who didn't talk back. An easy target. "You deaf or what?" Jake pressed, stepping closer. His voice carried, drawing eyes from nearby students. Marco met his gaze, steady and unreadable, and said nothing. That was the first mistake Jake made, thinking silence meant fear. Marco had learned early that words were cheap. His father had taught him to watch, to wait, to let others dig their own graves. "What's your deal, huh?" Jake continued, his smirk faltering just a fraction. "Too good to talk to us?" Ethan snickered, nudging Tyler. "Maybe he's just slow," Tyler chimed in. The hallway buzzed with curious glances, but no one stepped in. They never did. Marco closed his locker with a soft click and walked away, his steps even, his posture relaxed. Behind him, Jake's laughter rang out, loud and forced. "Yeah, keep walking, loser," he called. Marco didn't turn back. He didn't need to. He'd seen Jake's type before. Loud, desperate for control, blind to the consequences of their own actions. Marco had been raised to be patient, to let the world reveal its weaknesses before he made a move. But even patience had its limits, and Jake Harlan was testing his. That night, as Marco sat at the polished mahogany table in his family's dining room, his father noticed the quiet. Antonio Vitale was a man of presence, his broad frame and sharp eyes enough to command any room. He cut into his steak, the knife moving with surgical precision. "You're not yourself, Marco," he said, his voice low but firm. Marco hesitated, poking at his food. "It's nothing," he said finally. Antonio set his knife down, the small gesture carrying more weight than a shout. "You know better than to hide things from me." Marco exhaled, meeting his father's gaze. "Just some guys at school. They're trying to push me around. Antonio's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened. Names. It wasn't a question. Marco shook his head. I can handle it. Antonio leaned back, studying his son. Handling it doesn't mean taking it, Marco. You know that. Marco nodded, the words sinking in. His father had built an empire on respect, on knowing when to bend and when to break. You don't start fights, Antonio added, his voice softer now. But you don't let them walk over you either. Marco lay awake that night, his father's words looping in his mind. He didn't want to be the guy who solved problems with fists or threats. He wasn't his father. Not yet, maybe not ever. But he also wasn't the kid Jake Harlan thought he was. Tomorrow things would be different. Not loud, not flashy, just different. Jake and his crew had no idea what they'd started, but Marco was ready to show them that some shadows cast a longer reach than others. The fluorescent lights of Crestview High buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the crowded cafeteria. Marco Vitale sat alone at a corner table, his tray of food untouched, his eyes fixed on the scratched surface in front of him. The noise of the room, clattering trays, bursts of laughter, shouted conversations, washed over him like a distant tide. He was used to tuning out chaos. It was a skill honed in rooms where a single wrong word could cost everything. But today the chaos felt closer, sharper, like a blade grazing his skin. Jake Harlan and his crew were watching him from across the room, their smirks barely concealed. Marco didn't look up, but he felt their stares, heavy and predatory. They were waiting for a reaction, any crack in his armor. They wouldn't get one, not yet. It had been a week since the locker incident, and Jake's taunts had grown bolder. The shoulder bumps in the halls had turned into deliberate shoves. The whispers had become loud insults, flung like darts to see which one would stick. Yo, Vitale, you ever gonna talk? Or you just gonna keep playing mute? Jake had sneered yesterday, his voice carrying down the corridor. Marco had walked away, his silence a wall they couldn't breach. But walls, he knew, could only hold for so long. His father's words echoed in his mind. You don't let them walk over you. Marco wasn't planning to start a war, but he wasn't going to be their punching bag either. The tipping point came at lunch. Jake strode toward Marco's table, his crew trailing like hyenas scenting a kill. The cafeteria chatter dipped, eyes flicking toward the unfolding scene. Jake loomed over Marco, his shadow cutting across the table. What's this, loner? No friends to save you today, he said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Marco kept his gaze on his tray, his fingers resting lightly on the edge. Jake's grin widened, mistaking silence for surrender. Look at him, acting all tough, Jake mocked, leaning in. Bet you're scared stiff, aren't you, Vitale? Ethan chuckled, nudging Tyler, who added, maybe he's just waiting for his mommy to pick him up. Marco exhaled slowly, his pulse steady. He'd faced worse than this, men with cold eyes and veiled threats, moments where a single misstep could mean disaster. Jake was nothing, a loud mouth chasing clout. But then Jake crossed a line. With a swift motion, he grabbed Marco's tray and tipped it, sending a cascade of food, mashed potatoes, gravy, a half-eaten apple, splashing across Marco's jacket and onto the floor. The cafeteria went quiet, a collective intake of breath. Jake stepped back, laughing, his crew joining in. Oops, he said, his voice dripping with false innocence. Guess you'll have to clean that up, mute. For a moment, Marco didn't move. He looked down at the mess, the gravy soaking into his sleeves, the apple rolling to a stop by his shoe. Then slowly, he lifted his eyes to meet Jake's. There was no anger in his gaze, no fear, just a calm, unyielding intensity that made Jake's laughter falter. The room seemed to shrink, the air thickening with anticipation. Marco stood, his movements deliberate, and brushed a smear of gravy from his sleeve. He didn't speak, didn't flinch, but the weight of his stare pinned Jake in place. For a split second, Jake's confidence cracked, his smirk twitching into something uncertain. He covered it with a scoff. What, you gonna cry now? He taunted, but his voice lacked its usual bite. Marco stepped forward, closing the small distance between them. He was shorter than Jake, slighter, but there was something in his presence, a quiet menace, that made the taller boy shift uncomfortably. The cafeteria was a held breath, every eye locked on them. Marco's voice, when it finally came, was low, barely above a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a blade. "You're making a mistake," he said. Just 4 words delivered with a calm that sent a shiver through the room. Jake blinked, caught off guard, and opened his mouth to retort, but nothing came out. Marco held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned and walked out, leaving the mess and the stunned crowd behind. Outside in the cool air of the courtyard, Marco leaned against a brick wall, his heart beating faster than he'd expected. He hadn't planned to speak, hadn't wanted to give Jake the satisfaction of a response. But something had shifted in that moment, a spark of defiance igniting inside him. He wasn't his father, didn't want to be, but he was done playing the victim. Jake and his crew thought they'd won, thought they'd broken him. They were wrong. They just lit a fuse, and Marco knew exactly how to let it burn. That evening at the Vitale family's sleek, modern home, Antonio noticed the change in his son. They sat at the dinner table, the clink of cutlery, the only sound breaking the silence. "You said something today," Antonio observed, his voice calm but probing, his eyes never leaving Marco's face. Marco nodded, setting his fork down. "They pushed too far," he said simply. Antonio tilted his head, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "And?" Marco met his father's gaze, his own steady. "They'll learn." Antonio's smirk widened, a rare glimmer of approval in his eyes. "Good," he said, returning to his meal. "Just make sure they learn the right way." Marco lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He didn't want blood or chaos, didn't want to become the man his father was. But he also knew he couldn't let Jake's game continue. Tomorrow he'd walk back into Crestview High with the same quiet steps, the same unreadable face. But something would be different, a shadow stretching just a little longer, a warning woven into his silence. Jake Harlan and his crew had no idea what they'd awakened, but they were about to find out. The halls of Crestview High felt different the next morning, as if the air itself carried a subtle charge. Students moved through their routines, grabbing books, dodging latecomers, trading gossip. But there was an undercurrent, a quiet hum of anticipation. Marco Vitale walked through the front doors, his steps as measured as ever, his plain hoodie and unassuming posture blending into the crowd. Yet something had shifted. It wasn't in his clothes or his stride. It was in the way heads turned slightly as he passed, the way whispers trailed in his wake. The cafeteria incident had left a mark, not on Marco, but on the school itself. Jake Harlan and his crew had crossed a line, and Crestview seemed to sense that the rules of the game were changing. Marco kept his eyes forward, his expression unreadable, but he noticed everything. The sidelong glances, the hushed voices, the way a group of freshmen scattered when he neared. He didn't want this attention, hadn't asked for it, but his father's words rang clear. "Attention is inevitable, son. The only question is who controls it." Marco wasn't here to play king of the school, but he was done being prey. Jake and his friends had pushed him, tested him, and now they'd learn what happened when you poked a shadow and expected it to flinch. Jake, for his part, was trying to act like nothing had changed. He leaned against a locker, laughing too loudly with Ethan and Tyler, his voice cutting through the morning bustle. But there was a strain in his posture, a flicker in his eyes that betrayed his unease. He'd spent the night replaying Marco's words, "You're making a mistake," and the way they'd landed, soft but heavy, like a stone dropped into still water. Jake was used to fear, used to kids shrinking under his gaze, but Marco's calm had been something else, something that made his usual bravado feel hollow. He shook it off, or tried to. "He's nobody," Jake muttered to Ethan, who nodded a little too quickly. "Just some wannabe tough guy." Tyler smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. They all felt it, the shift, the unease, the sense that they'd stepped into something they didn't fully understand. The first sign came at second period. Jake opened his locker to grab his math book and froze. Tucked into the corner, half hidden behind a crumpled gym shirt, was a single playing card, the ace of spades. Its black edges stood out against the locker's gray metal, stark and deliberate. Jake's stomach twisted. "What the hell?" he whispered, snatching it up. He turned it over, half expecting a note, a name, something to explain it. Nothing. Just the card, its presence a silent taunt. Ethan, peering over his shoulder, tried to laugh. Someone's messing with you, man. Probably just a prank. But his voice was thin, and Jake didn't respond. He shoved the card into his pocket, slammed the locker shut, and headed to class, his jaw tight. Prank or not, it felt personal. It felt like Marco. By lunch, the whispers had grown louder. Students stole glances at Jake, their eyes darting away when he looked back. His usual swagger felt forced, like a costume that didn't fit anymore. He sat at his usual table, surrounded by his crew, but the energy was off. Ethan kept checking his phone. Tyler picked at his food, and Jake's attempts at jokes fell flat. Across the cafeteria, Marco sat alone, same as always, eating slowly, his focus on his tray. He didn't look at Jake, didn't need to. The weight of his presence was enough. Then it happened. A sophomore, nervous and pale, approached Jake's table, his hands fidgeting. Jake?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake glared at him. "What do you want?" The kid swallowed hard, glancing around as if checking for an escape. You don't know who he is, do you?" Jake's eyes narrowed. "Who?" The sophomore hesitated, then leaned in, his voice dropping. Marco Vitale." The name hung in the air, heavy with implication. Jake scoffed, but it sounded forced. "What, the mute freak? Spit it out, kid." The sophomore's eyes widened, and he took a step back. His dad. He's Antonio Vitale. You know, the Antonio Vitale. The words hit Jake like a punch. Antonio Vitale. The name was a whisper in the city's underbelly, a shadow that loomed over certain streets, certain deals. Jake had heard it before. His uncle, a small-time dealer, had mentioned it once, his voice low and cautious, like speaking it too loudly might summon trouble. Antonio Vitale wasn't just a name. He was a force, a man whose enemies vanished, whose reach was long and unforgiving. And Marco was his son. Jake's mouth went dry. That's not possible," he stammered. But the sophomore was already backing away, eager to disappear. Ethan and Tyler stared at Jake, their faces pale. "Is that true?" Tyler asked, his voice barely audible. Jake didn't answer. He couldn't. The rest of the day was a blur. Jake moved through his classes, his mind racing, his confidence unraveling. Every glance from a classmate felt like a judgment, every whisper a confirmation. The ace of spades burned a hole in his pocket, its weight a constant reminder of the line he'd crossed. He'd thought Marco was nothing, a nobody he could push around for laughs. Now he saw the truth. He'd been poking a sleeping giant, and the giant was awake. That afternoon, as Jake walked to his car, he felt eyes on him. He turned, half expecting Marco, but instead saw two men standing across the parking lot. They weren't students. Too old, too polished, their dark jackets and calm stares out of place in the chaos of dismissal. One of them caught Jake's eye and held it, his expression unreadable. Jake's heart pounded. He fumbled with his keys, got into his car, and drove off, his hands shaking on the wheel. He told himself it was nothing, just paranoia. But deep down, he knew better. Marco hadn't thrown a punch, hadn't raised his voice, but he'd made his move. And Jake was starting to realize that the game he'd started was one he couldn't win. At home that night, Marco sat at the dinner table, his father across from him, the silence between them comfortable but expectant. Antonio sipped his wine, his eyes studying his son. "Something's changed," he said, not a question. Marco nodded, his fork pausing midair. "They know who I am now," he said quietly. Antonio raised an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "And?" Marco met his father's gaze, his own steady. "They're scared." Antonio leaned back, his smile widening. "Fear's a good teacher," he said. "But it's what you do with it that matters." Marco lay awake that night, the events of the day replaying in his mind. He hadn't wanted this, hadn't wanted the whispers, the fear, the shadow of his father's name following him. But Jake had forced his hand, and now the school was watching, waiting to see what Marco Vitale would do next. He didn't need to fight, didn't need to shout. He'd learned from his father that power wasn't about noise. It was about control, about making others feel the weight of their own mistakes. Jake Harlan was feeling that weight now, and Marco was just getting started. The afternoon sun hung low over Crestview High, casting long shadows across the staff parking lot. Jake Harlan's sneakers scuffed against the asphalt as he walked, his head down, his usual swagger replaced by a nervous twitch in his shoulders. The ace of spades was still in his pocket, its edges worn from his restless fingers. All day he'd felt the school closing in, classmates avoiding his eyes, teachers glancing at him with something like pity, even Ethan and Tyler keeping their distance. The name Antonio Vitale had spread like wildfire, turning whispers into a roar. Jake had laughed off the sophomore's warning at first, but the two men in the parking lot yesterday, their cold, calculating stares, had made it real. He wasn't just messing with Marco. He'd stepped into a world he didn't understand, and now it was coming for him. He was halfway to his car when a voice stopped him. "Harlan." Low, calm, but sharp enough to cut through the hum of departing students. Jake froze, his heart slamming against his ribs. He turned slowly, expecting Marco, but instead saw the same two men from the day before. They stood near a sleek black sedan, their dark jackets crisp, their faces unreadable. The taller one, with a scar tracing his jaw, nodded toward the car. "Marco wants a word." Jake's mouth went dry. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, his voice cracking. The second man, shorter but broader, smirked, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Sure you do. Let's not make this hard." Jake's eyes darted around the lot. A few students lingered near their cars, but none looked his way. No one was coming to help. His friends were long gone, scattered like leaves in a storm. He swallowed hard, his legs heavy as he followed the men. The sedan's door opened as they approached, and there was Marco, leaning against the car, arms crossed, his expression as calm as ever. But this wasn't the quiet kid Jake had shoved in the halls or mocked in the cafeteria. This Marco was something else, controlled, untouchable, a shadow given form. The air around him seemed heavier, charged with a quiet menace that made Jake's skin prickle. "You thought I was nothing," Marco said, his voice soft but piercing, each word deliberate. He stepped forward, closing the distance, and Jake flinched despite himself. "You thought you could push me, humiliate me, make me beg." His eyes locked onto Jake's, unyielding, stripping away the last of Jake's bravado. "You were wrong." Jake's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to deflect, to laugh it off like he always did, but the words wouldn't come. Marco's calm was more terrifying than anger, his stillness more threatening than a raised fist. I didn't know," Jake managed, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean—" Marco cut him off with a slight tilt of his head. "You didn't know because you didn't care," he said. "You wanted to feel big, so you picked someone you thought was small. But I'm not small, Jake, and neither is my family." The mention of family sent a chill down Jake's spine. He thought of his uncle's stories, of men who crossed the Vitales and vanished, of deals gone wrong and consequences that lingered for generations. He thought of his own father, a small-time contractor with debts and secrets, and what a man like Antonio Vitale could do to him. Marco leaned in, just close enough for his next words to feel like a blade. "I could destroy you," he said, so softly it was almost a whisper. "Your family, your future, everything you've got. I wouldn't even have to try." Jake's knees buckled, his breath hitching. He believed every word. Marco straightened, his gaze never wavering. "But I won't," he said, and for a moment Jake felt a flicker of relief. Then Marco's lips curved into a faint, chilling smile. "Because you're already done." The men stepped back, and Marco turned, sliding into the sedan without another word. The door closed with a soft thud, and the car pulled away, leaving Jake alone in the empty lot. He stood there trembling, the weight of Marco's words sinking in. He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking as he checked his notifications. 5 missed calls from his father, 3 frantic texts from his mother. "Call us now. Something's wrong." And then a single message from an unknown number. "Tell your father to watch his contracts. Mistakes can be costly." Jake's vision blurred, his phone slipping from his fingers to clatter on the asphalt. He hadn't just crossed Marco. He'd invited a storm into his family's life, and there was no undoing it. That night at the Vitale estate, Marco sat across from his father, the dining room lit by a single chandelier that cast long shadows across the walls. Antonio poured himself a glass of wine, his movements slow and deliberate. "It's handled?" he asked, his tone neutral but expectant. Marco nodded, his hands folded on the table. "He won't touch me again," he said. Antonio studied him, his sharp eyes searching for cracks. "And the others?" Marco's jaw tightened. "They'll fall in line." Antonio took a sip of wine, a faint nod of approval. "You didn't raise a hand," he said, not a question. Marco shook his head. "Didn't need to." A rare smile crossed Antonio's face, brief but genuine. "That's my boy," he said. "Power isn't in the fist, Marco. It's in the fear. Make them feel it, and you'll never need to fight." Marco nodded, but as he left the table and climbed the stairs to his room, a weight settled in his chest. He'd done what he had to, protected himself, upheld the Vitale name. But he didn't feel like a victor. He felt like he'd stepped closer to his father's world, a place of shadows and silent threats, and he wasn't sure he could ever step back. At Crestview High the next day, Jake was a ghost. He shuffled through the halls, his eyes hollow, his shoulders hunched. His friends avoided him, their laughter replaced by uneasy glances. The school had changed overnight, the hierarchy upended. Marco walked the same halls, his head down, his steps quiet, but the whispers followed him now, not of ridicule, but of awe, of fear. He didn't acknowledge them. He didn't need to. Jake Harlan had learned his lesson, and the rest of Crestview would too. Marco had drawn a line, and no one would dare cross it again. The days following Jake Harlan's reckoning settled into an uneasy calm at Crestview High. The halls buzzed with the usual chaos, lockers slamming, sneakers squeaking, snippets of gossip floating like dust in the air. But a new undercurrent ran beneath it all. Students no longer looked at Marco Vitale as just another transfer kid. His name carried weight now, whispered in corners, passed between classes like a secret too dangerous to hold for long. The story of Jake's downfall had spread, twisted and embellished with each retelling. The ace of spades, the mysterious men, the black sedan that seemed to vanish into thin air. Marco hadn't said a word to confirm or deny the rumors, and that silence only fueled the myth. He didn't need to speak. His presence was enough. Jake, meanwhile, was a shadow of his former self. The once cocky senior shuffled through the school like a man haunted, his eyes darting to every corner, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets as if to hide their trembling. His crew, Ethan and Tyler, had abandoned him, their loyalty crumbling the moment they sensed the tide had turned. They sat at a different table now, their laughter forced, their glances avoiding Jake's hollow stare. The cafeteria incident, the locker card, the parking lot confrontation, it was all too much. Jake's reign as Crestview's untouchable bully was over, replaced by a paranoia that clung to him like damp cloth. Every phone buzz, every unfamiliar face, sent his pulse racing. The message from the unknown number, "Tell your father to watch his contracts," played on a loop in his mind. A reminder that his mistake had endangered more than just his pride. Marco noticed the change but kept his distance. He walked the same routes, sat at the same corner table, kept his head down as he always had. But the school saw him differently now. A junior offered him a seat at lunch one day, her smile nervous but genuine. A group of sophomores parted to let him pass in the hall, their chatter falling silent. Even teachers seemed to tread lightly, their usual reprimands softened when addressing him. Marco didn't want this. The attention, the deference, the unspoken fear. He'd only wanted Jake to stop, to leave him alone. But his father's world had taught him a hard truth. Power, once claimed, was impossible to unclaim. And Marco had claimed it, whether he meant to or not. At home, the air was different too. Antonio Vitale watched his son with a quiet pride, though he rarely voiced it. Over dinner, the clink of silverware filled the silence until Antonio spoke, his tone measured. "The school's talking," he said, cutting into his steak. Marco nodded, his eyes on his plate. They always talk, he replied, his voice low. Antonio's lips twitched, a hint of a smile. They're talking about you. Marco set his fork down, meeting his father's gaze. I didn't ask for that. Antonio leaned back, his sharp eyes studying his son. You don't ask for power, Marco. You take it or it takes you. You chose right. Marco didn't respond, but the words lingered. He didn't feel like he'd chosen anything. Jake had forced his hand, and he'd acted, not with fists, not with shouts, but with the quiet precision his father had taught him. Yet the victory felt hollow. He'd stopped the bullying, protected his space, but at what cost? The whispers followed him now, not just at school, but in his own mind. Every glance from a classmate, every hushed rumor, reminded him of who he was, Antonio Vitali's son, heir to a legacy he wasn't sure he wanted. The next morning, Marco found a note slipped into his locker. Plain white paper, folded once, with a single line scrawled in black ink. Stay away from Jake, you've done enough. No signature, no hint of who'd left it. Marco stared at it, his jaw tightening. He recognized the handwriting. Sloppy, rushed, the kind Ethan used when passing notes in class. It was a plea, maybe a threat, but it was weak, born of fear. Marco tucked the note into his pocket and closed his locker, his face unreadable. Ethan was trying to protect Jake, or maybe himself, but it was too late. The lesson had been taught, the line drawn. Marco didn't need to respond. The note was proof they'd learned. By lunch, the tension in the cafeteria was palpable. Jake sat alone, his tray untouched, his eyes fixed on the table. Ethan and Tyler were at their new table, but their usual banter was subdued, their glances flickering toward Marco's corner. Marco ate slowly, aware of the eyes on him, but refusing to acknowledge them. Then unexpectedly, a girl approached his table, a senior named Lila, known for her sharp wit and zero tolerance for bullies. She slid into the seat across from him, her expression curious but unafraid. So, she said, her voice light, you're the guy who took down Jake Harlan without throwing a punch. Impressive. Marco looked up, surprised but guarded. I didn't take anyone down, he said quietly. Lila raised an eyebrow, a small smile playing on her lips. Sure you didn't, but the whole school's talking about it. You're kind of a legend now. Marco's jaw tightened. I don't want to be a legend, he said, his tone firmer than he intended. Leela studied him, her smile fading but her eyes softening. Fair enough, she said, but you stood up to him. That matters. She stood, leaving him with a nod. See you around, Vitali. Marco watched her go, a mix of relief and unease settling in his chest. Lila's words were kind, but they carried a weight he wasn't ready to carry. Standing up to Jake had been necessary, but it had also marked him, tied him to his father's world in ways he couldn't escape. That night as he lay in bed, the note from Ethan burned a hole in his pocket. He didn't need to read it again. Its message was clear. Fear had taken root, and it would keep Jake and everyone else in line. At Crestview, the balance had shifted. Marco didn't gloat, didn't seek the spotlight. He didn't need to. He'd proven his point, not with violence or bravado, but with the quiet, unshakable strength his father had instilled in him. Jake Harlan would never touch him again, and the school knew it. But as Marco closed his eyes, a single thought lingered. Power came at a price, and he was only beginning to understand what it would cost. Weeks passed at Crestview High, and the storm that had swirled around Marco Vitali seemed to settle, leaving behind a strange, fragile calm. The hallways still hummed with the usual chaos, students rushing to classes, laughter echoing off lockers, the occasional shout of a teacher. But the whispers about Marco had softened, no longer sharp with fear, but tinged with a wary respect. His name, once a spark for gossip, had become a quiet boundary, a line no one dared cross. Marco moved through the school as he always had, head down, steps deliberate, blending into the crowd yet standing apart. He didn't seek the attention, didn't revel in the shift, but he couldn't deny it. Crestview had changed, and so had he. Jake Harlan remained a ghost. He showed up to classes, his presence a faint echo of the brash bully who'd once ruled the halls. His eyes were sunken, his movements jittery, as if he expected retribution at every turn. The message from the unknown number had done its work. His father's business was under strain, contracts falling through, whispers of bad luck circling their family. Jake didn't talk about it, didn't talk much at all. His former friends Ethan and Tyler kept their distance, their once loud loyalty replaced by self-preservation. The school had moved on, its social hierarchy reshaped, and Jake was no longer part of it. He was a cautionary tale now, a warning etched into Crestview's collective memory. Don't mess with Marco Vitale. Marco, for his part, tried to return to the routine he'd wanted when he first arrived. A quiet life, free of drama. He sat alone at lunch, worked diligently in class, avoided the spotlight. But the spotlight found him anyway. Lila, the senior who'd approached him before, became a recurring presence, dropping by his table with a quick comment or a sly smile. "You're going to have to get used to people noticing you," she teased one day, tossing a fry onto his tray. Marco shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I'd rather they didn't," he said. Lila laughed, undeterred. "Too late for that, Vitale. You're stuck with us now." Her easy acceptance was a small comfort, a reminder that not every glance held fear or judgment, but it also underscored the truth. He couldn't go back to being just another kid. Other students began to approach him, tentatively at first. A sophomore asked for help with a math problem, his voice hesitant but earnest. A junior invited him to join a pickup basketball game after school, quickly adding, "No pressure, just thought you might want to." Marco declined most offers, polite but firm, but he noticed the shift. They weren't just scared of him anymore. Some genuinely wanted to know him. It was a strange feeling, one he wasn't sure he trusted. His father's world had taught him to question motives, to see every gesture as a potential play. But Crestview wasn't that world, not entirely, and Marco found himself caught between the lessons of his upbringing and the possibility of something new. At home, Antonio Vitale observed his son with a keen eye. The dinner table was their unspoken battleground, where silences spoke louder than words. One evening, as Marco pushed his food around his plate, Antonio set his glass down with a deliberate clink. "You're restless," he said, his voice low but probing. Marco glanced up, meeting his father's gaze. "Just figuring things out," he said. Antonio's eyes narrowed slightly. "You've handled the school. What's left to figure?" Marco hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I don't want to be you," he said finally, the admission hanging heavy in the air. Antonio didn't react at first, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. "You think this is about being me? This is about being you, Marco. You took control, set a boundary, made them respect you. That's not my world, that's yours." Marco looked away, his jaw tight. "It doesn't feel like mine," he said quietly. Antonio studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "It never does at first," he said, "but you'll learn. Power's not a choice, it's a responsibility." The words stayed with Marco as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. He'd stopped Jake, protected himself, but the cost was a shadow he couldn't shake. The note from Ethan, the fear in Jake's eyes, the whispers that followed him, they were all part of the power he'd claimed. And power, as his father said, wasn't something you could set down. It shaped you, whether you wanted it to or not. Marco didn't want to be his father, didn't want to live in a world of threats and shadows, but he also knew he couldn't be the kid who let others walk over him. He was something else, something he was still defining. At school, the new equilibrium held. Jake avoided Marco entirely, his gaze dropping whenever they passed in the halls. Ethan and Tyler kept their heads down, their bullying days over. Lila and a few others became Marco's tentative allies, their presence a bridge to a life he'd once thought impossible. He didn't trust it fully, not yet, but he let it happen, one small step at a time. Crestview had learned its lesson, and so had Marco. Power wasn't about noise or violence. It was about control, about knowing when to act and when to wait. And in his silence, Marco had found a strength that was his own, a strength that would carry him forward, wherever his path might lead. Months had passed since the reckoning in the Crestview High parking lot, and the school had settled into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary. The spring air carried the promise of summer, with students buzzing about exams, prom, and plans for the future. Marco Vitale walked the halls as he always had, hands in his pockets, head slightly bowed, his presence quiet but undeniable. The whispers that once trailed him had faded, replaced by a subtle respect that lingered in the glances of his peers. He wasn't a king, not a hero or a villain. He was simply Marco, the kid who'd rewritten the rules without raising his voice. Jake Harlan was gone. Not physically. He still attended classes, slinking through the school like a shadow. But the boy he'd been was a memory. His family had moved to a smaller house across town, his father's business crippled by unlucky deals that no one dared question. Jake kept his eyes down, his voice silent, a living testament to the cost of crossing the wrong person. Ethan and Tyler had reinvented themselves, trading their bully personas for safer roles among the crowd. Crestview had learned its lesson, and the lesson held. Marco, too, had changed, though the shift was harder to see. He still sat alone at lunch most days, but Lila and a small circle of others had become fixtures in his orbit. Lila's sharp humor and fearless honesty were a counterpoint to Marco's quiet reserve, and he found himself listening more, even laughing sometimes. A junior named Sam, who'd once asked for math help, had started joining them, his nervous chatter filling the silences. They weren't friends in the way Marco had imagined friends might be. No late-night calls or shared secrets. But they were something real, something he hadn't expected to find at Crestview. He guarded it carefully, like a flame that could gutter in the wrong wind. The weight of his father's world still hung over him, though. Antonio Vitale watched his son with a mix of pride and expectation, his rare words of praise always laced with a challenge. "You've carved your play," he'd said one evening, his voice low over the clink of wine glasses. "Now hold it." Marco nodded, but the words felt like a tether, pulling him toward a future he wasn't sure he wanted. He'd proven he could wield power, could command respect without bloodshed, but every step in that direction felt like a step away from the normal life he'd once hoped for. Normal wasn't a word for Vitales, but Marco wasn't ready to let it go. One afternoon, as the final bell rang, Marco lingered in the school courtyard, the spring breeze tugging at his hoodie. Lila found him there, leaning against a tree, his eyes distant. "You look like you're solving the world's problems," she said, dropping onto the grass beside him. Marco gave a small smile, shaking his head. "Just thinking." Lila tilted her head, studying him. "About what?" The great Marco Vitale mystery continues. He didn't answer right away, his gaze drifting to the horizon where the city's skyline blurred into the haze. "About what comes next," he said finally. Lila raised an eyebrow. "Next? You've already conquered Crestview, Vitale. What's left?" Her tone was light, but her eyes were serious, sensing the weight behind his words. Marco exhaled, his fingers tracing the edge of a worn notebook in his lap. "I don't want to conquer anything, Manam," he said. "I just want to be me. Not my father, not a name people whisper, just me." Lila was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Then be you," she said simply. "You're already halfway there." The words stayed with Marco as he walked home, the city's hum a backdrop to his thoughts. Lila was right. He was halfway there, but the other half was uncharted. He wasn't his father, didn't want to be, but he couldn't erase the Vitale name or the power it carried. He'd learned to wield it, to turn silence into a weapon, to make fear a teacher without becoming its servant. But power wasn't his destination. It was a tool, one he'd use to carve his own path. At dinner that night, Antonio's gaze was sharp, as if sensing the shift in his son. "You're quiet," he said, his fork pausing midair. Marco met his eyes, steady and unflinching. "I'm deciding," he said. Antonio's brow lifted, a rare spark of curiosity in his expression. "Deciding what?" Marco's answer was simple, but it carried the weight of everything he'd learned. "Who I'm going to be." Antonio didn't respond, but a faint smile curved his lips, a silent acknowledgement that Marco was no longer just his son, he was his own man. The dinner continued, the silence between them not heavy but alive, a space where Marco's future was taking shape. At Crestview High, the story of Marco Vitale became a quiet legend, Not of a bully's downfall, but of a boy who'd faced power and chosen his own way to wield it. He didn't need fists or threats, didn't need to shout or dominate. His strength was in his silence, in the calm that made others pause, in the choices he made when the world expected him to break. Marco had learned the hardest lesson of all. True power wasn't in ruling others. It was in ruling yourself. And as he stepped into the unknown, that power would light his way, a beacon in the shadows of his name.